So please give a warm welcome to Shea Hembrey.
Thank you, and thanks so much, John. You were a pleasure to work with, and I always thought, well, if he's worried about what I'm going to do, he'll ask questions. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep making stuff, and in a way, I just keep making up till the deadline, so I'm not sure what it's going to look like. You know, it depends on what I get done by the time they pry it out of my hands. And thank you so much, Kate, for sticking in there. She came back at night, and we've soldiered on and got it done. Thanks, Ed. Thanks, everyone. And Rebecca, I don't think's here, but thanks for being so welcoming. And it makes it really comfortable. And you're not afraid to ask for anything, which is really nice. I did a marathon talk at the UB the other night, so I'm going to try to keep this one short to balance it out, especially for the poor souls who are here again. And I'm going to talk a little bit about material more in this one to kind of reflect how I think. So all this work in this show is from the last 6 months, and normally I work for like 2 years on a project, and then after 2 years, then I'm willing to show something, so I'm kind of doing it ass backward in this one. But it's something I'd thought about for a long time, working with ash, and like what could I do with the material of just ash. And the more I worked with it, the more I realized, like, okay, I have to add some things to it to make there to be some different speeds and different variety and a little bit of color. But I'm happy with black always. Black is something I've worked with for years, so it's like I'm happy with gray as well. It's endless varieties. This is a painting that is upstairs, and so it's just ash with binder, and the way I made them was just build up tons of coats of ash and binder, then sand it until I had this smooth pattern, and then like you would do a hard edge painting, tape out a pattern, and then build up ash again, and then I took a wire brush to remove the pattern. So it looks kind of delicate, but is really aggressive to get down to that layer, and I like when some of those tones are just my hand oils, just working it with my hand at a certain point, and then the tones change and get darker. And that's from one of the walls, which is 71 different religious texts burned, and then each bagged, a cup and a half in each bag. And they're on scale pans, so there's a balance and parity to each one. That's a detail of the ash on the wall, which the way I made that was painting it in clear acrylic binder, just like the other painting, and then just throwing it really hard, and then it stuck places and didn't stick other places. And this is a detail of some of the cones. And then again, salt on the floor and piles of ash as well. So the thing I like about simple materials, one thing that I did for myself a few years ago was, many years ago, I did my MFA at Cornell, and I used straw, which is something I used to work with as a kid. And I like working with it environmentally because it's something that can go back in the garden. I like when it was done, that show, they went to the community gardens, and that's the reason behind the limestone here that could go into the gardens. It's something I also worked with when I was a kid, and I gave myself an assignment. I've given it to myself a couple times, like we're only working with materials that I worked with when I was 5, so really simple materials. So this one and the detail of it. And in this piece, I often do something like in this show, the jars are my grandfather's, who was a healer. Like I'll slip in the sentimental something that means something to me. In this, my grandmother's sewing needle is hidden in it. So if you tell a kid, they spend it all, it's funny to watch them try to find the needle, and they do find it eventually. It's down in lower. That's that piece that was at Cornell, the straw room. And in this particular piece, it was just cardboard. I made a fake cardboard floor, 4 foot up, just made columns out of sheets of cardboard, and then made a fake floor, and then just worked the straw until we came to the door. The vortex was out of aviary netting. I used to breed birds, and so I'd worked with aviary netting a lot, and so I sewed that tornado shape, and it just came in, and then it's filtered with charcoal, so it looks really, really deep. This piece you viewed from above, and when I took it down, it was filled with coins. People had thrown coins in it, and I think part of it, they knew printmaking was below it if you knew the building, and it looked like it went on forever. But because it was like that much of filtered powdery charcoal. When you threw it in there, you couldn't hear it, but it would disappear, and then the charcoal would cover it. So people, I think, also kept throwing coins to figure out why didn't they hear it and where was it going. And so one of the first things I remember always making things out of chicken feathers. We raised chickens, and this was a sculpture out of rooster tail feathers. And I really like how it is in different light, like it's red in one direction or green in another. And that vortex form has come up again and again when I play with physics and the dark hole and dark matter and all these things that for years I've tried to play with questions of reality. How can I show what our best scientific understanding of the structure of cosmos is? Sometimes they get really fun, but I keep coming back to that again and again, and like those piles on the ground are the negative of that. I mean, I'm seeing, just looking at the show, like how that playing with those things forms again in a different way. So I did a biennial project. If you're not familiar with that project, you can see a TED Talk about it where I introduced it. It actually was debuted at TED. It was a secret before I went on the TED stage in 2011. And in that project, I created 100, in 2 years I created, so it was a true biennial. I created 106 artists and then picked 100 for the biennial. And so each week I was a different artist. Since then, I've referenced back. I love playing trickster when I'm asking questions about reality. So every once in a while, I'll play a fiction or character or have something going on with them. And this particular work, this is 3 or 4 years ago, I had a fictional character named Pawnee Calhoun who was creating these natural history specimens, these things he was collecting in the wild. He was claiming he was collecting them in the wild. So there was a small book about this in these projects. That birds or insects were making. And you can see again, it's very much like the straw installation with the vortex in the middle. Here it is being harvested and put in the back of the truck. And this one, I called this like super collider anomaly. I was thinking about friends who's staying in Switzerland at the Large Hadron Collider. Anyway, this is out of hornets' nests. I took 6 hornets' nests, took them apart and reconstructed them with paper mache. So paper mache is something I keep coming back to from like childhood as well. Like, when can that be a simple solution? And they make that paper by chewing up bark and leaves. So sometimes it's something I'd thought about working with for probably 20 years. Like, how could I work with that paper that they make with their body? When I was at Cornell, I worked with my mouth quite a bit because I was working with nesting and birds a lot, and so I would do drawings by blowing or using my mouth and just thinking about how did a bird sculpt this thing, and how do they sculpt a nest with their body, and so forging my body against things to make them and then using my mouth. So I've thought, as for a future project, it'd be interesting to make paper with my mouth. This is it being collected. And in this one, which is called Oven, it's like on a fence row with a pile of ash below it. Here we are, ash again. I kind of had forgotten about this piece having that connection. Burning has always been a big thing in my work. Oftentimes sculptures smell like smoke, or I char them to get a black sometimes. Even I'm thinking now of connections I hadn't thought of until. And here it is collected. I love the collecting images. They just seem really fun to me. When John came to visit the studio, I was actually making stuff out of pipe cleaners and dipping them, just like you did in kindergarten, pipe cleaners, and then I dipped them in sand and glue, and they would make these really wonderful complex forms. You wouldn't believe it was pipe cleaners until you said it, and you're like, oh yeah, that's pipe cleaners. But it's such a simple thing. And in these next few sculptures I'm going to show you, it's similar. This is wooden cubes, little toy blocks, and also cubes that I cut tons, and toothpicks. And this is from a whole series of what I was calling full cosmic models, full models of the cosmos, which is a fun challenge. The more I've made them, the smaller they get, which I think is fun. I think eventually they need to be brooches, maybe. They're really tiny. I remember making things out of burnt matches as a kid and, you know, popsicle sticks, all that kind of stuff. Just how can you use it? And for a few years, like, that was my assignment. And this project, that's what was going on, only those things. I was allowed to paint them, interestingly, with different kinds of finishes. And this one, it's painted with like a blue mica paint so that as you move, it changes. It's kind of like a butterfly's wing, like how you view it. It looks quite different. This shows you a little bit. And then in the back, there's glass spheres that are on just wood. Questions? I like when people ask questions. Yeah, yeah.
It's this, is that the piece with the cones up there, first of all, is there some type of adhesive holding that together?
Yeah, which one? The
The cones? And then secondly, what do you use to get is there specific thing you use to get the shapes?
Yeah, I don't know which one you're calling cones.
Upstairs, the cones.
Oh, upstairs. Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so that's just paper cardboard cones that I cut the top off and then paper machéed them, the tops the way I wanted them. So super simple craft material. And then they came stacked inside each other, so they took up, like, I'd painted them each 4 times, and I've sprayed the 5th layer here. So yeah, it was just a spray adhesive. Because I tried different things, I hand painted, I did different things, but that turned out to be the simplest. I don't like working with spray adhesive that much because of the smell, but like this turned out to be was such a delicate powdery thing, right? Like that turned out to work the best. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm wondering about your process,
Mhm.
how organic it is or how versus how planned it is. And I get that you've been working since a child with materials.
Right.
And so it's natural to you.
Right.
So can you just talk a little bit more about how you plan the pieces?
Right. So ideas, usually it's idea driven. So like I keep thinking about what am I trying to get across and then trying to marry that to a material that's going to work. Sometimes it needs to be time based. Sometimes it needs to be sculpture for the experience of it. I probably overthink material, but and how is a viewer going to? Me and John were talking about this. You know, when someone views the work of art, they have a natural place they stand, and so I want to think how can you alter where someone stands or do something when they stand there. So like your natural diagonal from that corner to that corner on a painting is like people come into that field and that's where they stand. Then they either go forward and back if they like the painting. So what can you do there that maybe draws them to another piece or, so that kind of thing is how I overthink things probably, but yeah, I hope I answered that question. As far as, yeah, absolutely.
So you clearly work with mostly natural materials, and that, as was just said, you've been doing all your life. Do you attribute that to coming from Arkansas, or what is that attributed to? And also, secondly, do you ever get concerned about the duration of your materials or the longevity of them?
Yeah, some things are mindfully fugitive. I want them not to be owned. And then there's like an in-between period. Say that the black feather sculpture is on a rigid black structure and it could be replaced in 100, the feathers last about 100, 150 years if they're treated properly. So it could be replaced. So I keep that in mind if it's going to be like a sellable thing or not a sellable thing. I just try to be really as conscious as I can to not waste. So before I make a piece, I want to make sure that I'm not wasting materials, that I develop it enough before I do an experiment with materials. I feel like the idea should be good enough. It needs to exist in the world that I'm willing to use those resources, even paper. And the natural material thing, it's nice because we own the core of the family farm now. Now I can grow. Like I'm going to grow, a field of gourds for a project. So it's nice to have that starting from nothing, and which is something, when you grow up on a farm and the fields, and I often just think of how it got to some place, right? Like, and how can I be a part of that? And like that straw was going to be burned. Like they burned the straw fields there. So like I actually turned it into something, and then it went to a garden rather than being burned. And it's not always natural materials. I paint quite a bit. I'm not going to talk about too much painting tonight, but I often make my own paint using binders, and the pigments like in this case it was ash that I had burned. It can be soil that I collected. I just want to have a connection to the material. So that's, I think, so often why it's a natural material.
I'm not gonna run on the question, Shea.
Yeah.
It's, what's your, background as an artist? Did it come to you naturally, or did it just, was it?
Yeah, so
evolution?
I went to college. I wanted to be an ornithologist, and my aptitudes were in the sciences. I had art only to 6th grade in a small rural school, and I happened to take a painting class my freshman year, and I was like, people study this? You can do stuff with this? I was always creative, but I didn't, think about it as a field. And then I went on and did 9 years at university. So even though I think of myself more self-taught in a way, because like so much of what I do is things I've done, I spent a year studying Maori art in New Zealand, which really changed how I think about materials and art. For them, it's often not what something looks like, it's the process of making. So I'm part Native American, and because of that, they let me weave with them. When you meet a Maori person, they recite their heritage to you. You share one breath. You do the hangi where you come nose to nose, you breathe out one breath and breathe in one breath together to say, we're sharing the same plant, the same place, we're sharing the same resources, and then you recite your heritage. So I would do the whole thing. Well, the best I know, we're Irish, English, German, Scottish, Choctaw, Cherokee, and just the way they would do the tribes. And then I would get invited to make things because they could tell me all about Native Americans. Compared to Americans, wouldn't have a clue, but they were really tuned into that. And I did some of the weavings actually at one of the universities, because I turned out to be a really good weaver, they said. I really had tight hands was the thing. But that was really interesting because it was a holy activity. So if you were going to go to the bathroom or eat, which was taboo for you would stay, I have to go to the bathroom. Everyone would recognize that you would go wash your hands, go use the bathroom and come back with wet hands. I've washed my hands. And then you'd go back to work. And but for them, it was the stories that we were telling and the talk we had as we wove. That was in the piece. It was a recording, as if it was a video recording of it. So like when a Maori tattooing on the face, that is a face shield. It's each time they're tapping it, they're saying a prayer. So that prayer gets bound into your face. So you have a mask that's just a prayer that protects you. So thinking in those terms did have an impact on me, how I think as an artist, and where materials, their sources are, thinking about even time. I think the best way I had time described to me as Maori time versus Pakeha time, non-Maori time, is if this is the future and this is the past and it's linear. For Westerners, we have our eye on the future. We're going forward, and we can stop and look if we want. And if we really want, we can turn around and look back on the past. For the Maori, they're watching the past. As they go into the future, the present becomes present, and the future is a mystery. But they can tell you about their ancestors. They can tell you, they're mindful always of what's become before. And that gave me the best understanding of how important history was for them and family. So that was really interesting. I purposely wanted to study non-Western art for a year, and I didn't really make that year. I just went to museums and, immersed myself in the work. I think that's a luxury everyone in the West should take if they can. It makes you think about objects in a very different way, especially, whether things last or not, or whether it's, there's that, in a way that's very Western, you want something to last 1,000 years, right, and be in a museum. And I fight against sometimes the market with purposely wanting to make things that are fugitive or only exist out in nature and that only can be documented, right? There's a purity in me for that. Sometimes I need to do it rather than my work ending up in wealthy spaces, which is the case, usually. So Hope that was an interesting diversion. I don't know what the question was there, but something. Oh, yes, my background. And then I'm MA and an MFA in painting, even though Lindsay, one of my friends who went to Cornell with me, will tell you I didn't paint in those 2 years, even though I was in the painting department. I did everything else. I felt like, wow, there's all this equipment. I should play with all this equipment. And but I do think I think like a painter. And even noticed making things, I was using paintbrushes. Like even without realizing, I'm making with a brush or a palette knife, carving with a palette knife without even realizing it, so it's in the back of a brush without really. And I think it was because I had long hair for 15 years and my brushes were in my hair. I had a whole array of them and I could just put my hand and I knew what I would grab, which tool it was. And so I think it was always the first handy tool, right? It wasn't a pencil, it would be a brush. So this one is another one of the full models of the universe, and it's on an old skateboard. So the back of an old skateboard. So if something's broken or damaged, I'm like, oh, that could be a support for something. And if something needs to be filled in, I'll take garbage that I've collected or paper and paper mache with it, or fill in the gap with garbage, and just so that I'm not wasting materials. This is another one, a piece of, lead's one of those things. We used to make sinkers for fishing. We'd do it in our backyard, me and Dad, and so we always had scrap lead, which I always thought was so seductive and beautiful. This one's called Cosmic Doodle, so and it's got a Tahitian pearl that I brought back from Tahiti and a piece of chrysoprase from India, and it's just got all these cosmic doodles on it. It's fun to walk around, and it's on that. Toothpicks again. And this one's another one with lots of toothpicks and dowel bits and cubes. I wanted it to look like an eye and eyelashes, but also have this, when you stood in front of it, in the Star Trek, all the movies when they go into warp, there's that moment where it shoop, and I was like, how would you do that with simplest materials as possible? And so it's just toothpicks that go deep and it gets darker, and then the tips of some of them have gold on it, and so the way that the light hits it, it does have that quality of shoop, and no tech at all, right? Completely low tech. And this one, the detail of this one, that's beetles' wings. This particular beetle has been used in Indian art I wanted to use it after seeing at the Met a show of Indian miniatures, and they had cut it up for the emerald jewels on the portraits. And even 1,000-year-old pieces, it's also on old Indian garments. It's just really lasted through the years. And I always grew up with June bugs. We'd tie red thread on them and walk them around like pets as a kid. And I wanted to collect June bugs for this piece, but they're just not around anymore. I looked, for a few years I kept watching. I was like, so it had to be the substitute from Asia. But I really like their quality of being green at one angle or blue at another angle. This is the full piece, and I just wanted to seem like this is another full model of the cosmos. I just want to seem like a whole bunch of spigots pouring out energy, and I thought, how do I want that to look? And I ended up settling on horsehair. It's all wooden balls and dowels and lots of black glass beads on top of it. Horsehair is also something I used to sew with as a kid. You'd pick it out of the barbed wire fence, and I always thought it was so cool. It was so different colors and interesting material. And this was the first time I've ever worked with horsehair, and I went to, I was like, well, where do you get horsehair in mass? Well, it turns out it's usually processed in China. When they use everything on a horse in China, and then they sort it. And so I went to the biggest dealer in America. It's in a field in Ohio, to go to their hair warehouse, the horsehair warehouse. And so you pulled up to she's like, follow the GPS. You think you're going nowhere, but it's really correct. And you just drive through ruts on a cornfield, and then there's a warehouse, and you knock on the door and they let you in, and there's 20 people working there. And then they also sell soccer balls. Apparently they're the biggest soccer ball dealer in America as well. And I was like, what is this? And she said, well, when eBay started going, I just started buying stuff. And she said, horsehair and soccer balls took off. And so she let me go through, and I needed to touch it and see what it was like, and I got to spend, half a day sorting through her horsehair and picking out the ones that spoke to me. You'd buy whole tails. So this is from a series of, I was thinking about like, okay, how would I map the full cosmos? So I was looking at lots of the best maps that they had of space and deep space and, you know, what they, theoretical maps, and thinking about how could it be interactive? Like I wanted it to respond to a viewer in some way, but my first inclination always, rather than to have tech, is can the material do it? And so these are built on metal like satellite dishes. They're convex, large dishes, and I wanted, since we're getting that data from space, that's how we're reading it. I wanted that, and also that concave shape, so when the viewer walked up, it would surround them. So this is turkey and stork down. So when you walk up to it and stand in front of it, it starts moving just because of your breathing. And then if you lean in, it really just starts to move. And if you try to breathe heavy, it just becomes this fuzzy movement. And I like the idea of playing with, like, I can color code the universe however I want it. Like, I know from current understanding that the warmest parts of the universe is where matter is. So I can play with that idea, and it can be color coded as wild as I want it to be. So these are actually from an Arkansas fishing lure company where they dye them all kinds of crazy colors because they're going to be viewed underwater. So that was also fun, going to the factory, and that's a thing with me. Like, this is a field trip, right? Like, I remember as a kid when we'd travel and we never could stop nowhere, and so now I'm like, I'm gonna take a trip just to go and look at the down, and that was amazing because the colors are wild. Like, even as paint color, you wouldn't choose them or see them as a mixed color, and that was fun playing with what those could be. I wanted them to have that delicacy and softness to the universe. And what was fun after, like right when the show went up, two things happened. I think that week, they're wild acidic colors, and also weird mossy colors too. It was just weird colors to choose from. It was fun to watch people, I was saying, the kids blew them like crazy, but also everyone else blew them as well. Like you had this permission to blow on them. So this was a case of me just making up what I thought that those maps should look like. And then the week that they showed them, dust maps came out. They released dust maps of cosmic dust in space, and that's the top ones, and they look so much like the pieces that I did. And then the next two ones are Laniakea, and that came out I think the week after that, and it's a map of our galaxy group. And you can see like the galaxy groups looks like a single piece of down feather, like it's each one. The bottom, these are our neighbor and us. So matter really does have, galaxies are in rivers and clusters. So it was a happy accident, both of those choices of how to color it and how to make it look, and then also the material that I had chosen. Any more questions? I feel like I've yammered on a adequate amount.
Yes, fantastic.
I feel like if you're curious at all about my practice, you can watch the TED Talk and get a sense of that thing instead of me slipping into Sybil and being a multiple personality. But for me, like, identity isn't a part of my practice. It's like I like ideas that transcend identity, and I can play with them in some way that's these bigger questions. So I don't mind playing trickster when I'm asking questions about reality and presenting it in strange ways.
I guess I'm wondering where that does come from. Where does the design...
The whole trickster thing, it probably comes, and it's been reinforced in our current world where, like, is this truth? Is what's really going on? And people should be asking questions always. Is that real? Is that reality? Is this going on? I would say the trickster is probably a Native American thing in many ways. And I grew up on a dirt road in Arkansas where it was storytelling always. You went visiting, and like that was your, like even today when I'm home again on the farm with mom and dad, like if he goes to the grocery store, he comes home and tells a 15-minute story about the trip to the grocery store. Everything is a story. It's always that way. And you know by the language whether it was a made-up story or not. Like, and so it's those nuances of being, I think, a rural Southerner and always getting stories and knowing like I remember as a kid not knowing when the older men and women, whether they were pulling my leg or not, and I was like, was that it really? Or what do they mean? And it took a while before you knew when trickery was going on and when it wasn't, and I always delighted in that, and also the delight in their straight face of tricking you, and sometimes you'd let them trick you, and I still let like them. So that entertainment value, but it's important, I think, when you think of a sense of trickster in society, and not when they run society, but when you have questions about, you question what they say and what is presented and how, yeah.
Question.
Yeah.
Sorry. Just made me hungry for Southern food. Can you talk about your favorite food?
My favorite
How
food?
how they, how.
Yeah.
I feel like you must have some connection to food. I don't know.
Oh, yeah. I was, there's the Center for Southern Culture is in Oxford, Mississippi, at the University of Mississippi, and they do a conference every year called the Southern Foodways Alliance. And so it pulls in Southerners from all around the diaspora, all around the world, to cook and tell food stories. And I was their artist in residence a few years ago, and it was amazing because just the food for the days. But yeah, I forget that I have food stories because, of course, we grew up hunting and fishing and trapping most of all our meat, and then the rest we grew, and then the garden, was just hugely important. But my things that when you ask what I miss or what I think of, it's what can't be bought. It's wild greens, that you can only harvest 1 week. Those kind of things. Muscadine, which is, a wild grape. Just really distinctive tastes that kind of only the older generation knew, because I grew up on the farm with both my parents and my grandparents, and so, across the field was my grandmother's house. So I had breakfast at our house and my grandmother's house. And I had dinner and I had two mothers, and two fathers, it was really great that way. So I crave, it's weird, when I was living in New Zealand, I craved like our homemade recipe, our homemade sausage patties for breakfast, and they didn't have them down there. They had links that were different. You never know what you're going to crave, but yeah, poke salad, you've heard, poke salad is a wild green, which is actually toxic. That's something that I really, really love. And so we figured out a few years ago that that week when it was ready, Dad would set up he sets up cauldrons and he cooks enough for the year so we have it. And because that was me asking for it all the time. And we started to plant it around the fence rows where we have it. It's a perennial crop, so we've been kind of helping that be perennial and really easily available. So that's one of those things. I mean, it's hard to describe unless you've been down there and had it at that time of year. It makes me think of, because we hunted and fished and did so much of the stuff, like when we had frog legs, we'd go frog gigging, and my dad did this as a trick to my mom when they first got married, because she had never cooked frog legs, because they'll jump out of the skillet when they hit the hot grease. And they're quite large, the big bullfrogs. So you have to you get a big bowl and you fill it with salt water, and then you throw them in and they just start doing this. So as a kid, anytime we were going to have frog legs, we were like, put on the show, it was so exciting to watch them do the whole movement. So a lot of it's macabre stuff like that, my dad's favorite meal still is squirrel, and of course, my mother makes a pan of cornbread every day. So it's there's this staple thing. And so when you go up north and there's square cornbread and you're like, it's yellow and square, that is not cornbread. So it's the daily bread that's white and blackened in a skillet, and so all those kinds of things, yeah. I've just moved to Louisiana, so I'm getting that Cajun influence on the Southern, which that French-Canadian, the French Southern mix, Creole mix is really, really nice. So, yeah.
What was India like?
Pardon?
I would love to go to India. I've studied Hinduism and stuff like that. Artistically, this is kind of, I don't know, take too much more of your time in the audience this time, but artistically, I'm past ideas. I'm all past ideas.
Uh-huh.
And I'm curious about belief systems. I think there's so many different belief systems that, I'm curious about what you believe in.
Yeah, I didn't spend time in India. You have to talk to Lindsay. She spent time in India. That's the only thing I didn't collect myself. I collect the pearl in Tahiti on that piece, but I kept trying to think of something I wanted to pair it with turquoise from Bisbee, Arizona, but the color wasn't right. So I kept having these choices, and it finally turned out to be like chrysoprase wasn't discovered until I think the 60s. So it was like the most, and I had to hunt down a piece, and it was the right color blue. So sometimes it's like you're stuck on a color, and it's not something you collect, and you have to find it, and yeah. In that case, I thought turquoise was right. It wasn't. It had to be teal. So there's not a lot of teal gemstones. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for coming.